Hi friends, today we get to hear from Kuddes all about folk song research. If you enjoy hearing about what Kathy refers to here as histories beyond the page in our song material, I think you will love this conversation. Kathy is the coordinator of the Plano Kodai training program, and she's the lead instructor for its partner program at the Meadows School of Fine Arts at Southern Methodist University in Dallas, Texas. And you can find her full bio in the show notes. Now, also in those show notes, there's a link to Kathy's live binder of folk songs. I don't know if you're familiar with this already, but it is a lovely corner of the internet where Kathy has published some of her adventures in folk song research. And again, that's in the show notes along with her contact info if you want to drop Kathy a note and say thank you. You can watch our conversation on YouTube or listen on your podcast player. And with that, I am thrilled to bring you Kathy Kuddes. My name is Victoria Bowler, and this is episode 84 of Elemental Conversations. Kathy, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me today.
I'm thrilled to be here. Thanks for the invitation.
Absolutely. We were saying right before we pressed record that this is an area that you have a lot of interest in and that you've been doing for a while in several different capacities. So can you talk to us, just to get us started, Kathy, about what is folk song research and who is it for? Like, why would elementary music teachers be interested in folk song research?
Sure, it's a great question. So from my perspective, it started early on as just having wonderings about some of the song material I was using with kids or that I saw people using with children, things that showed up in all of the pedagogical textbooks as recommended resources and things. And with the kids, it started out with things like questions about unfamiliar text, like Phoebe in her petticoat, kinds of questions, and modern day children not having a real context for a word like petticoat and needing somebody to sort of explain so that the text of the song they were singing made sense to them and they could envision something like that. So that was sort of the dipping the big toe into this idea, right? That every song has a story, whether we know it or not.
Mm.
And so, being just kind of a historical nerd in that regard, I started just digging through the material, starting with the materials I owned or that
Mm.
I had on my classroom shelf, digging through to see what I could find. I had always had an interest in variants, being
Yeah.
interested in folk song. One of the classic characteristics where we can really point to a song and say, yes, it must have lived in the oral tradition at some point, is the existence of variation, either in text or tune or rhythm or all of the above, right? Depending on what community it lived in for a period of time. And so that was kind of the place I began looking, right? And then as we started to question the both the authenticity and the
Mm.
appropriateness of song material that had been passed down to us as part of the canon of music teacher songs, people started asking questions that I didn't know the answers to. They clearly didn't because they were asking those questions.
Mhm.
And so then it became sort of trying to get to the beginnings, to the where did these songs really sprout up? Where were they invented? How did they come to us? Many of them, because of our country's history, are Anglo-American, coming from the British Isles, but there's certainly many more that come from other parts of the world, other languages. They came on boats and canoes and all of those things with people who came here from elsewhere, and over time either got translated or transliterated, or
Mm.
sometimes just um, I I caution against the word appropriation. A more appreciation, and somebody added a new text for a new experience or situation, and so we get a lot of textual variations, etc. And it just became sort of an itch I had to scratch whenever somebody asked about a song,
Mm-hmm.
to start digging in. And I don't really know how many years ago now it's been that Lauren McDougall kind of published the list of
Mm-hmm.
songs with questionable pasts, which was a great place to just begin the conversation of kind of crowdsourcing songs that people had questions about, or that were causing people consternation and making them uncomfortable. But it doesn't really go, the list itself doesn't go deep enough into the actual research. It's really a starting place. And I happen to know Lauren. It came out of, her kind of desire to help identify some of these songs so that people could dig in, recognizing that she didn't really have the bandwidth to do all of that research herself. And so it's been a great jumping off point. And I noticed, looking at it fairly recently, that in the last couple of years, she's done some curating in terms of sort of grouping songs in
Mm-hmm.
various categories based on the issues or questions around them, so that teachers can sort of think about, maybe this group of songs with derogatory racial terms need to go away in my classroom, and
Mm-hmm.
these others that there are stories that imply perhaps that that they might have had other meanings
Mm-hmm.
that are a little more adult than our elementary children are ready for, that those need a different kind of dig to see if I still feel comfortable using them in the classroom, et cetera. I think that's been really helpful to the conversation as well, to begin to sort of separate some of the issues into various subsets, because there are lots of different reasons that people question a particular song. And I think that a universal truth that music teachers sort of agree on is that it's never
Mm-hmm.
our intent to choose a song to be intentionally derogatory, or to create an uncomfortable environment for our students. Sometimes we do that unknowingly
Mm-hmm.
when we don't have the background information that we need, or that others have, right? So I think that's part of what sort of has spurred me on to do some of the research and writing that I've done about some of the songs that have shown up there. Um, and some I have had to, unfortunately, give them a kiss on the cheek and send them on their way, as it
Mm-hmm.
were, and step back from using some songs that had been very valuable to me as an educational tool.
Mm-hmm.
And others, I hope that I've been able to resurrect their their use in the classroom, by doing enough research to call into question some of the things that you read on the internet, for example, that often aren't well sourced. So I think, it became, and then I have to say that I think that we're in a period in our technological history that makes this sort of work much easier to do.
Mm-hmm.
I am old enough to have, used a card catalog in my life many a time. It's an actual library. But that's a big, arduous, time-consuming undertaking, and you have to live in a place where a big university music library is accessible to you, even.
Mm-hmm.
And recognizing that just isn't a thing for everyone. So so many resources now have been digitized and are available
Hmm.
from the comfort of your couch or your home office, that it's still a time consuming process, no
Mm.
question about it. And I can go down a rabbit hole for days on end about a particular song. But the resources that are available electronically have certainly made that process easier and more accessible to more people if they have the desire to do that sort of thing.
That's great, Kathy. You've given us a really broad overview of the role of this research process and why it's so critical today. It's always been critical, but especially today. I think, you brought up the list. And I think for many people, that kind of spurred this, there's like this spark, of for some people, a renewed interest, and some people, it kind of solidified their interest, as it was in your case. And then in some people, it was a newfound interest, right? So this is an area that
Right.
a lot of people are coming to right now with a lot of different lenses, and that's the praxis of critical thinking, right? Where each
Correct.
individual teacher, we will not have the same uniform thumbs up, thumbs down, thumbs in the middle list, but it's the dialogue about that process that's really valuable to the community as a whole.
I couldn't agree more. I always caution teachers that, the ultimate decision of what stays and what goes, what you use and what you don't use is your responsibility. You really are the curator of that classroom collection.
Mhm.
And you and your administrative team or colleagues in that region need to have those tough conversations about how do we feel about these songs and how are we presenting them. I think
Mhm.
the other thing that this research has done for elementary music education in particular, has opened up the conversation about talking to kids about the history of these songs and where they come from and what their meanings are or could be in a way that we didn't always. It was just a tool to get
Mhm.
to a new melodic or rhythmic or formal concept. And we didn't spend a lot of time putting songs into context for kids. And I see and hear and talk to teachers who are doing much more of that today
Mhm.
than was the case even just a few years ago, wanting children to sort of know where these songs came from and how they came into the classroom and where how they got to our shores and became part of our sort of standard
Mhm.
canon in addition to what they do for teaching basic music concepts.
Sure, sure. That's a great place to kind of pause and dig in because we're talking about these songs as an educational tool, and we're also
Mhm.
using the word folk song. And I'm curious about your take, Kathy, about how you would describe a folk song. Like, what makes it a folk song as opposed to something that is composed by a specific individual or something that has been kind of collectively decided this is, going to be an educational tool that we use in the classroom. How do you delineate all of these categories? And also within folk songs, how would you delineate, what's a play party and what's a ballad? And how can we start to think about these categories as we go into research?
Sure. Well, it's a great question. The ethnomusicologists have been trying to define folk song for well over 100 years, and you talk to three ethnomusicologists, you get five definitions. So
Yep.
it's a very tricky kind of a question, but in essence, I think that the big criteria is that there's evidence that it lived in an oral tradition at some point in its lifetime, which is getting harder and harder, because there are so few communities that are really cut off from mass media
Mm-hmm.
and interconnected communication. So, a century or two ago, people lived, in their own geographic center, traveled maybe 50 or 100 miles from that center through their whole lifetime. And songs sort of lived within those geographic areas,
Mm-hmm.
and only traveled out on occasion to be passed around, which is how we find really ancient songs with lots of variation,
Sure.
etc. So variant in the collected canon of a particular song is another important marker for divining that as folk song.
Mm.
I think that I am less concerned today about labeling things folk song versus composed song. Although if it's been composed, I think it's important. It's an important part of its history
Mm-hmm.
to maintain the identity of um, of that creator in a way that folk song is typically, community created and so listed sort of anonymously or labeled by that community or culture to which it's connected versus a specific individual along the
Mm-hmm.
way. But there are great pieces of repertoire appropriate for the classroom that are from a purely folk oral tradition, centuries old, and others that are more contemporary and have been penned for that purpose,
Mm.
songs that have sort of worked their way. I always think of songs like "This Land Is Your Land,"
Sure.
that when people hear it, everybody just sort of knows it. It has taken on a folk like life, but it's very clear. We know who wrote it. We know when it was first presented to the
Mm-hmm.
populace, and it just struck a chord and was embraced, right? So yes, it's folk-ish and definitely has lived its folk life, but we can definitely, still look at Woody Guthrie and know where it came from, and how it became part of that canon. And I hope that teachers are also looking to art music as another resource
Mm.
for repertoire in the classroom. And so I think sometimes the conversation about strictly using folk song in the classroom is a little too narrow, because there are lots of other great pieces of song material that, again, if we're using them as tools to propel our musical knowledge
Mm-hmm.
forward, um, it's not inappropriate to select some really beautiful melodies from great pieces of art music. And now, as we're working harder to be more authentically inclusive,
Mm-hmm.
we're looking at folk song or even composed song from outside of our own personal community.
Mm-hmm.
And those resources have expanded exponentially in the last couple of decades as well. So
Mm-hmm.
the amount of material, I always tell teachers when we're talking about pedagogy and classroom use, is that I really think that planning your curriculum is way more about what you're leaving out than what
Mm.
you're leaving in, because there's so many great choices and so little instructional time
Yeah.
that those are the hard choices, right? To figure out what you have time to include and what you just can't get to. And gosh, yeah, there's so much that we leave out, and not always because we want to minimize that contribution, but simply we run out of time to get to it all.
Right. Right. Yeah. Every yes represents many, many, many no's in our repertoire selection. Yeah. Which is
Correct.
kind of an overwhelming viewpoint for me to look at like this huge collection of books or other resources and to say like, oh my goodness, I'm going to pick this tiny little sliver, right? But that's one of the reasons that, especially in your work that you do training Kodai teachers, that's one of the reasons that you emphasize repertoire selection so much, and one of the reasons that we take a repertoire-based curriculum really seriously.
Absolutely, because again, what we're including, because it's such a minuscule percentage of the
Mhm.
overall possibilities, right? It does place a really high level of responsibility and priority on those choices along the way, because you are passing by lots of other options,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
right? And you have to be pretty clear about why you're choosing the things you're choosing and why you're skipping the things you're skipping.
Mm.
Um, and I think parents, administrators, teachers, colleagues are asking those questions in a much more straightforward and direct way than they ever did before.
Right. Right. Yes. Yes. When I think about all of the resources that I have, I'm looking at a bookshelf right now, and you made a comment earlier, Kathy, about how, today it's so much easier to access all of this information about the backgrounds of songs, and certainly because of digital resources. But I'm also just thinking about some new-ish books that have come into print recently, like Susan Brumfield's new book that has a lot of song notes.
Mhm.
Karen Howard has her
Yep.
new-ish book as well. So we have, and this is to your point about the industry, just in general, we see a lot
Mhm.
more attention being paid to this type of interaction with our songs. And with that, we also get what you mentioned earlier, which is because of how much is on the internet, sometimes it can take a discerning eye to, look at a comment and say, hang on, I don't know if that's quite how I would, oh, I don't know about that. Like, let's dig in a little bit deeper, right? So when you think about, Kathy, some of the criteria that your resources that you would like to see them meet in order to be up to just your standard of folk song research. What comes to mind? Is there anything that you have, like a maybe a formal or an informal kind of checklist that you want to see from a resource?
Well, I would agree wholeheartedly and endorse all of those resources that you've just highlighted, because I do think that this whole conversation has caused publishers and collectors of songs who are putting out materials specifically targeted at music educators, that they are investing a lot more time and frankly page space to this kind of information, and maybe just as a window for your viewers into kind of how that goes. Every page adds a cost to that publication, so the decisions of an editor and a song collector in
Mhm.
putting these resources together is, I know Susan really well, and we've had these conversations that it's a struggle to find the balance of providing enough information
Mm,
that teachers who pick up the materials feel confident about what you're telling them, and that you can substantiate the information that you're providing without being so verbose about it that now no one can afford your collection,
right.
because of all of the additional appendices and things. So, as a researcher myself, I always appreciate sources that allow me to retrace their steps
Mm,
as researchers, that they show me where they have done their research. That's tricky because, again, um, an appendix like that at the back of a book adds some dollars to the cost, but it does, for those who want to dig in a little deeper and again see perhaps what had to be left off the page because of space constraints, etc., that you can walk back to some of those resources is always a big plus for me. But I'm, I'm a particular kind of nerd in that regard. So I get that not everybody wants or needs that kind of information. Um, it's helpful to kind of know the mindset of some of the people whose materials you're looking at. And Susan and Karen are two of the people I would definitely look to
Mhm.
in that regard. And looking at sort of world music collections, because we haven't really settled on a really good label for those, but
Mm.
the looking for culture bearers, people from those parts of the world or living embedded in those communities for a long period of time,
Mhm.
um, also gives me a higher level of confidence about the authenticity and the collective background that you're getting in collections like that. And historically, there were lots of well-meaning musicologists who went into communities for a brief period of time and gathered up song material and
Mhm.
published them, and didn't fully understand the communities that they were representing. And
Mhm.
so some of those early, all the slave song collections, a lot of those were Anglo,
Mhm.
white folk going into those communities, and they you can imagine that the informants didn't give them everything
Mhm.
that they knew about the songs, right? Because there was a lack of trust and confidence about what would be done with that information. And so those are the kinds of things that I look for. And then just to recognize that this is a relatively new focus in song collecting and song collection publishing. And so I think it's one of our challenges right now is taking our kind of contemporary 21st century aesthetics about those kinds of things and trying to impose them
Mm.
on collections from the 1920s or 30s or even 70s,
Mhm.
recognizing that that just wasn't it wasn't deemed necessary, that nobody thought anybody cared about all of that historical background, right? So just a genre label or a cultural moniker in the upper right corner was enough. And so it's it's helpful to know that these songs were appearing
Mm.
in textbooks or in collections in that period, but then you just have to put sort of that historical lens on top of that and go, okay, but what do I know? Now I have to go digging into who were those collectors and what were
Mm.
the circumstances of, of them doing this work in this place. How did they come to, did they did they actually meet someone, transcribe, record,
Mhm.
have a personal interaction with someone around this song, or was it borrowed from someone else's collection in,
Mhm.
and brought into a new publication? One of the challenges in talking about variants, as we were doing a little while ago, is that publishers also had a tendency, still do in some regards, to tweak a quote unquote public domain folk song
Uh-huh.
in order to be able to slap a copyright label on it, right? And then and sometimes when those things happened in school books in the 40s, 50s, that version of that song became sort of the standard version,
Mhm.
when it might not be the most authentic, um, along the way, and some school book publishers were really meticulous about keeping their records about where songs came from and how they altered them or didn't, and who first brought it forward and all of that, and
Mhm.
and others have not. And so many of the historical publishers have gone the way of the dinosaurs now.
Yeah.
You don't even have access to those records to know how
Mhm.
they came across songs. So it's easier than it used to be, but it still has a lot of challenges.
Mhm.
And every once in a while, well, quite often actually, I get to sort of a dead end with a song and just have to put it aside for a while and come back and dig a little deeper down the road. And I'm working on a song right now that there's a big gap in the middle of the history I can sort of piece together. And I don't know what happened in that spate of time and how this song got here or came from where, it's just a really fascinating sort of thing. I'm pretty confident that I don't believe everything I've seen in print,
Mm.
but I can't find the connective tissue. And there's about 25 years of blank space in between the collection points at the moment. So it's
Mhm.
these are the things that just sort of happen when you get into this work.
Yeah. Yeah, and then the hunt continues for those missing 25 years, right? And then I'm sure,
Yes.
Kathy, that when you find the answer to those 25 years, that will lead you to a new question and answer maybe something in another song, and then you have to go update your file over
Absolutely.
there. Yeah, and it's all interconnected.
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah. So let's jump back to the print resources. I'll put you on the spot and just
Okay.
if off the top of your head, if you were to think about your Patricia Shane Campbell's, or we mentioned Susan Brumfield, we
Yeah.
mentioned
Uh-huh.
Karen Howard, any other just in your mind reputable either collections or researchers or anything like that. What is on your list of, just in your opinion, like really good anthologies or really good print resources for people to use again as a starting place?
Sure. Well, as you said, Susan Brumfield's new 101 Little Songs, because she really, while her 100 Little Songs did some of that, she really kind of doubled down
Mm-hmm.
in the newest publication and included a lot more of her research. She had done all of that in the previous collection, but hadn't
Yep.
included all of that information. And the First Steps in Global Music, Karen's most recent, kind of personal collection, did that on a more kind of global scale.
Yep.
But Karen Howard is also um, editing, and I apologize, I don't, uh, for, wait, for the World Music Initiative through GIA.
Yep.
Um, it's a whole nother set of collections. And Karen is serving as kind of the executive editor of these collections. She's not doing the collection work herself. Um, and what I love about there are several in that series, and more coming all the time. So I
Mm.
would just encourage people to keep an eye out for those. They are culture bearers and ethnomusicologists, kind of a pair in almost every situation.
Mm-hmm.
Someone who grew up, lived, breathed, the cultural context and the usage of these songs, with a researcher steeped in that culture, but with the musical skills to make transcriptions and some of those kinds of things.
Mm-hmm.
And each one of them has a little different format. That drives me a little crazy because I'm just sort of type A and like everything to fit into a neat similar. But I think they come indigenously from the culture and the collaboration of the collectors. But those are really well researched and beautifully contextualized in a variety of
Mm-hmm.
different ways, depending on which collection. that you're looking at. And so I would encourage people in that direction. Again, Pat Campbell was kind of the, she was doing this before it was cool, before we had labels for it, before we really even knew we needed it, right? And she continues, I think, to be a shining beacon in that regard. She's doing more of kind of what Karen's doing now. It's sort of editing and identifying culture bearers and encouraging them to gather their resources and put them together. So anything that she has sort of put her blessing on, but you don't see as many things with kind of her name on it. She's semi-retired, and I think encouraging others to kind of take up that banner.
Yeah, she's put in her time. She's done a lot of work. She
And
deserves a
then
break.
some.
Yeah.
And she's not really done. I
Right.
mean, I watch her on social media, and she's still out there talking and collecting and encouraging people. But I think she's not leading the charge as she was for so many years. Um, and then again, I would just say I look now much more into whose name is on the cover of that collection, and what can I find out about them. I don't pretend to know all of the people who are deep into this work around the world, but um, I want a bio of a collector who has really invested time and energy, and has a really deep connection to whatever community of songs that they are presenting, to teachers as possible use. I think one of the things that it does is it gives me a higher confidence that if someone in the community thinks that these are songs that it is acceptable and appropriate to share outside the community, then I feel more comfortable trying to find a place for it in my classroom curriculum. I've always cautioned teachers, particularly about indigenous music, Native American, Maori, whoever, because so much of that music is ceremonial in one way or another. And in those communities, often the doing of that music is restricted to a very narrow, very specialized, highly respected subset of the community, that even the children of the community aren't invited to participate in these songs. So why would we be teaching them to non-tribal children in a school classroom? That, and again, we didn't know all the things that we needed to know at the early on, and thought, oh, we're being so inclusive by doing these things from these communities without really understanding that we were really kind of stepping over a line, in the same way that religious music of all kinds, has a place, but it has to be very carefully contextualized in a public school setting. If you're teaching in a Catholic school, you have a range of song material available to you that the average public school teacher probably is hesitant to touch on, but that's a community that expects that you're going to dig into some of that chant and some of those other things and provide some context, and you have the ceremonial um, framework to do it, where you wouldn't in a grade school classroom. Kids learn songs at Hebrew school that I wouldn't be comfortable doing. Some I would, but
Sure.
some belong in the ceremonial area, and I'm always cautious about that. So again, people who live and have grown up and have really immersed themselves in those communities,
Mm-hmm.
if they're sharing out to people outside the community for educational purposes, then I think you can feel like yes, this would be okay to use with my children in whatever my educational setting is outside of that community. And some of the older collections, I'm a little less confident about some of that.
Yeah, songs live in a context. Songs were created not
Absolutely.
as isolated sonic events, right? And they, to us, can appear, like you're talking about in some of these older texts, they can appear as an isolated sonic event because it's just the standardized Western notation on a page, which is, of
Right.
course, like such a flat way to view what is actually a very dynamic musical interpersonal event. Yeah,
Right.
absolutely.
Right.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and that really actually reminds me, Victoria, that one of the things I really try to impress on teachers in my summer courses um, is the importance of not just finding songs in books, but getting out onto YouTube and Spotify and wherever you know get your audio information and looking for and listening to performances of various kinds of songs so that you get a feel for the performance practice that and it's tricky because there's a lot of cover work out there on the internet as well. So, you know, looking for field recordings, going back to the old Smithsonian records and all of those kinds of things to hear traditional performances sort of in their context in the wild if if you can call it that so that you have a feel for how these songs really lived when they lived in people's ears and in community practice, right? Because we tend to bring, as traditionally trained Western music educators, you know, we tend to bring all of that business with us to the notation, and it can turn into a really kind of square uninspired experience both for us and for the children, you know. So very often I one of the examples I use in class a lot is a little Anglo folk song, Hop Old Squirrel. And you very often find it, you know, written out, Hop Old Squirrel, idle dumb, hop old squirrel, idle dumb dee. And it's very, you know, and the most all me ray does, and you know, it has lots of, you know, pedagogical possibilities. But when you listen to the Seeger family sing it, as they heard the recordings their mother was transcribing, you know, for it's hoppled squirrel, addlem, hoppled squirrel, addlem, dee. Well, now it's a play song, right? You can imagine kids, and it has like a dozen verses. You're hopping and skipping and chasing and catching and doing all kinds of stuff, rather than the one verse that we usually see in a textbook. So now it has all of this additional context. And so now I get to decide how I want to present it to my children. Are we going to just read me, right? You know, off the notation and call it done? Or are we going to skip and chase and play and have fun and let it live and breathe as a game song, which was how it began? And it got kind of ironed out, and we sucked some of the life out of it, most of the life out of it, if I could be so bold, in the way that we transcribed it into textbook. And so I think that the book part in terms of tracing history and seeing how it was transcribed by various collectors is helpful. But I always want to try to connect to some quality recordings too of traditional performers from whatever period or community culture
Mm-hmm.
that it comes from, so that when I represent it in front of teachers or children,
Mm-hmm.
that I'm doing it with as much authenticity as I personally can muster.
Mm-hmm.
Because that's where the life comes from. It's not on the page. As you say, that's a very flat representation of
Mm-hmm.
the fullness of what it is.
Yeah.
And especially for songs that are labeled game, play party, skipping rope, if there's an action involved in the genre label, then you absolutely have to get it up off the page and find its life so it can live in your classroom.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Along those similar lines, as we're wrapping up here, I do want to touch on any other digital resources that you're particularly drawn to. You mentioned Smithsonian Folkways. We've talked about Spotify. We've talked about YouTube. We might have mentioned like Library of Congress kind of recordings. Anything else in the digital world, just very quickly, that you find yourself going to?
Well, my I have two kind of I always I'll say three that they're where I start. If it is the English language of it, rhyme, children's song, any of that, the first place I go is the Roud collection, Roud. At it's a branch of the Vaughan Williams Foundation over in the UK. Um, it's a it's a database, so it if you put in an opening title or something, it will pull up a series of other resources where you can find it. You can't get to the resources there. It's just a list of, oh, here are all of the places that text turns up, but it gives you a list of places to kind of go looking. Similar to that, the Cal State Fresno has the Ballad Index, which is a similar kind of database where titles can be searched, and then they will give you a list of places where you could find it in print, sometimes even recordings as well. Um, and then with that information, I usually end up at the Internet Archive at archive.org, which is an amazing digital library. It's because it's digital, it's books that are older, generally speaking, not the newer things that are still under copyright and all of those sorts of things, but the all of the really important early collections are available there, and it's a free subscription, so you don't have to pay any money to have access. And so I can usually find about, say, 85 to 90% of the resources that I've found from those other two searches, I can find then in electronic format. They have a much bigger and more complete collection than, say, Google Books or Gutenberg, which are other places that you certainly could try. But I've found that Internet Archive really has the bounty, as it were.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Great site for sure. Okay, so Kathy, wrapping up here, if we listen to all of your wisdom here and we get so excited about folk song research and we look at our list for this coming fall and we say, oh, I cannot wait to research all of these things, but I don't know where to start. Oh no, now I'm overwhelmed. So, Kathy, as we're wrapping up, can you help us with how to kind of conceptualize maybe some of the steps that you're taking or maybe some of the questions that we can ask ourselves? How can we
Sure.
move forward with this interest?
So I think a list is great. But then you have to prioritize the list. Like, which are the songs that either I have the biggest questions about, or I'm the least certain about, or that I really want to use the most. However, whatever causes you to put a shorter subset of that list right at the top. These are the ones I'm gonna invest my time in, right? Because there's always another song you could do. And so an alphabetical list is kind of a dangerous thing because it's entirely too, there's not enough prioritization. So you kind of get your short list going. Um, I always start with the things that I have on my shelf, the collections that I already have right at my fingertips. What do I have? What do I find there? I usually just start an open doc, whether it's a Google Doc or just a Word document on your computer, and I just start. I usually scan or take a clip of the, picture of the page with the notation, and then capture a full biblio citation for the resource so that I can go back, including the page numbers and all of that, because if I need to go back to it, I want to be able to go right there and not have to search it. So, and with as much information as those resources provide me, right? And so for a while, it's really just like a big box that you're just throwing stuff in, anything related to that particular song just sort of goes in the document. And then once you've and then I go to those places that I just mentioned. I go to RAD, I go to Ballad Index, I start digging into those materials. um, I go to Folkways and Library of Congress and just start plugging in song titles or opening lyrics, to see what comes up, and put just dump all of those links into a single place. And once you feel like you've looked at most of the things that have turned up in sort of your random searches, then you can kind of go back and start sorting. What do I have here? How many variants do I have? How much information, how much repetitive information am I finding that the story seems to be consistent through all the things, or each of these resources, their citation is this one. Sometimes that happens, that a song shows up a lot of places, but the the source that everyone cites is this one source. And if you haven't found that one source, then that's the treasure hunt for that particular one, to see if you can get a feel for, how did this become the source for this particular song. And sometimes they're, because it was the one collection of the time that was from someone who had embedded themselves in a place, and brought it back and started sharing. Sometimes it's a weird little oops along the way. I've written a couple of times about, just discovering that the Lucy Locket I knew was sort of a mistake. that that she really didn't come to us as a So Me Law song, but but actually was assigned to a different tune for a long time. And again, that what happens in music teacher circles is we share stuff with each other at workshops and training programs, and just in conversation. And the next thing you know, a song takes on a life of its own, and the origins are lost along the way. So but it's great fun. I wouldn't try to tackle more than one or two at a time, because you can get, down the rabbit hole really quickly. And sometimes you'll hit a roadblock and you just can't find anything. In that case, you might set that song aside, both in your research and maybe in your usage, for a bit, until you happen on something else, or you start asking other people with similar interests, have you found anything about such and such? And somebody will have thought about it. Somebody will have found something you haven't found, which is the great thing about having a community of people with similar interests, because there's always more to be found. And I don't object to even just a little Wikipedia search with the song lyrics and stuff. I again, the thing I appreciate about Wikipedia is I can retrace the steps because all of those citations are there at the bottom of the article. So I don't have to take their word for it. I can look and see how they've interpreted what they found in those places, which is always, I think, an important step to remember that everybody, every researcher, every writer is filtering, is bringing their own backgrounds, biases, information, all of those things to whatever they write. And when you start consolidating information, again, you make decisions about what to leave in and what to leave out. And so if you want to kind of retrace steps and see what was left in and what was left out and how you feel about that, it's always helpful to be able to do that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Kathy, this has been just an absolute delight for me. This has been wonderful. Where can people find you and connect with you? Maybe you want to talk about your live binder. Maybe you want to talk about Kodai levels. Where can we find you?
Sure. Well, so summertime, I'm in Fort Bend, Texas, down in the Houston area, doing a Kodai training program in June there for Fort Bend ISD, and then our Plano Kodai program is here at SMU in Dallas, and that's 3 weeks in July, and we're always looking to share all that Kodai brings to the teacher tool bag during those courses. Um, I My website is kodaimusic.com, and it's you can I try to keep it up to date about where I'm teaching or presenting. And it's become a place where I've just got lots of links to lots of other resources, lots of online song collections and various things. And that's always a work in project process. And on the website, there is a link that takes you to my online song collection, which is the live binder that you referenced. I just always say to people, it's been there a while and it is still a work in progress. So there are still links without songs because I just haven't gotten everything transcribed like I want it yet. Some of those transcriptions date back a few years, and gosh, I need to go and make some updates and clean up some things, so some grace as you dig into those materials because they are not perfect, and I am more than aware that they are not, because that's really the work. When I studied with Jill Trinka, and she was really the person who kicked this door wide open and shoved me through it. um, and she used to call that this was a life's work, that a song collection, the research around it, the ideas about how you use it in the classroom, that you're never done with it. There's always more to do. There are always more songs. There are always, tweaks to the notation or additional resources you want to add, more context. And so a it's the gift that keeps on giving, and it keeps you going and gives you something to do in your retirement. all those all of those kinds of things. And so yeah, I'm keenly aware that it still needs a lot of work, that there are lots of things I would like to go back and fix in my spare time, and I'm doing that little by little. Um but I made a conscious choice to just put it out there in the world for teachers to have those resources available to them, recognizing that these songs didn't belong to me to start with, and they don't belong to me now. And if they can be of use to someone in their classroom, then that was the intent.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Well, I'm so grateful for your time today and for all of the work that you do in folk song research and, training children and training the teachers of children so that hopefully, the more people get interested about this, the ideas and the information, it just spreads and spreads and spreads. So I want to thank you for all of your efforts in this area.
Thanks so much. And there's a contact link on my website if people have further questions or want to engage about specific songs. I'm more than happy to do that.